Full tragedy. The government set up an independent inquiry into the risks of living in a tower block. Today, preliminary results of that inquiry are being published. The report's author, Dame Judith Hackitt, says a culture change is needed to ensure safety is prioritised over costs in the construction industry, that building regulations are confusing and the profession suffers from competence issues.
The interim report tells us that what we have in place today is a system which has evolved over a number of years. It's overly complex and that complexity doesn't lead to it being as effective as it needs to be. We're talking about a system which is where there's too much prescription, where there is a very heavily layered system of guidance currently, which is not helpful in terms of leading people to the right answer. So my aim for the future is to create a much simpler and more straightforward system that will be easier for people to follow, but that needs to be reinforced with a number of changes in behaviour, which will include a major culture change across all of the players in this.
Judith Hackitt, and the chairman of the Local Government Association, Gary Porter, joins us now. Why is it so complicated at the moment?
Just the way the regs and the guidance have been drafted. What we've had is several years of additional regulation and additional guidance being added and no simplification. This has really been a problem in store since 2006.
Right. Is it going to be easy for local authorities? Are they in a position to actually change the rules or at least put into practice some of the recommendations?
We can't change the rules. The government needs to change the rules.
Yeah, but will you be in a position to implement them?
If the rules are changed, local councils where we do building control will be implementing them. We called for the review of the building regs. Within a week or two of the fire, we called for the regs to be looked at. We were clear from the test results that were coming in there was systemic failure across the country. That can't be down to one or two individuals who are not competent. That must be that the system was wrong.
Right. Or is it a case of people interpreting the regulations to suit themselves?
If I've only quickly read the report, or the draft report, and of the recommendations, there's only one in there that I would disagree with not being strong enough, and that's the ability for the industry to do desktop surveys and to do a study, not of real materials in real life circumstances, but on a computer modelling. That's probably one of the areas where we need to get to grips with this. Putting limited combustible materials on high-rise buildings is going to be fraught with difficulty. It would probably be simpler, and it's not for me to rewrite the rules, but no combustibility.
Right, no combustibility at all. But do you think that's actually going to be what happens?
I doubt it.
Right. I mean, do you get what you pay for when it comes to these sorts of things?
Definitely not. On some cases, some of the materials used would be more expensive and more dangerous. This isn't about a cost cut in... That's a red herring. Anybody who thinks that these fires take place because people are saving money on the materials used are incorrect.
Right. Do you accept that, Stephen Kinnock, that it isn't just about money?
I think we've had, for many years, a culture of privatisation and contracting out and austerity, and that creates a toxic combination, which I don't know whether there's a direct link from that culture to what the tragic events of Grenfell. But I really welcome what the report is saying today about the need for a culture change, because I do think that our public services need the resources and the empowerment to actually be able to take control of this process, because the more you contract it out, the more you allow the profit motive into this, then the higher the risks become.
Right, but we've just heard from Gary Porter that actually you can have more expensive materials and actually they can be more combustible. So the link that you are talking about, if you can't see a link between austerity and safety, why mention it?
I think it's about the way it's managed and implemented, and I think that you'll find companies that will look to cut corners in order to cut their costs, not so much necessarily in terms of the materials they're using, but in terms of the way they do their job and the way that they take that forward.
That argument? There are no councils in this country who would endanger their lives, their residents, to save a few pounds, no matter how hard we are done by, and the fact that we are a couple of billion short on what we need to be able to deliver services properly. Fire safety would not be an area that a council would compromise on. Right. More buildings in the private sector are at risk from this than councils own. There are 15 councils with buildings that are caught up by this, and it's not to downplay the seriousness of the fact that we've got 15 councils, but that's out of 400. The vast majority of buildings that are going to be affected by this fire, and more importantly probably going beyond this fire, other safety concerns with high-rise buildings, are going to be in the private sector.
What do you say about that? That actually it isn't a case of public versus private, that private sector buildings or people who own their own homes in tower blocks like these are just as much at risk?
What we know is, in the case of Grenfell, that many warning signs many red flags were thrown down by the residents, and they felt that there were things happening in that building that caused serious concern, and action wasn't taken. I think the key challenge that we have is to make sure that accountability is right, that the report looks at this in the broadest possible terms, and so that we never see the awful, tragic mistakes that were made in Grenfell happening again.
And, Suella, Stephen has a point insofar as, in October this year, the government had not released funds to make tower blocks safe following the Grenfell Tower fire, according to some councils, when asking for funding for cladding and sprinklers. Why not?
Well, I know that to date the government has responded quite extensively. You know, that there's nothing anybody can ever do to bring back people who died and to
but
erase
these are funding
tragedy.
Requests from councils which they haven't responded to.
But the government has set up a fund whereby if councils are needing support with carrying out the requisite installations, there is a process by which they can go to government, and those requests will be considered, and I think that's the right thing to do.
Right, are you now reassured that there aren't tower blocks in this country that are still at risk from these sorts of fires? There are people living in tower blocks in the UK who are in danger.
I'm reassured that tower blocks that are in the ownership of councils and housing associations are all now identified, and appropriate safety measures are taken in the interim. So they'll have fire wardens doing 24-hour cover. There's one with a fire engine parked permanently outside the building. So the ones that the state owns, I am perfectly comfortable with, that we are doing as much as we can to make those safe. What I am concerned about is the vast majority of buildings that are affected by this are in the private sector, and as of yet, we still don't know where they are. The BRE, the people who have done the testing, we've called for them to release all of the test failures that they've got, and they are still refusing to release test failures. So we don't know what materials are safe, and we don't know what buildings are clad in what to make them safe.
You say that councils wouldn't do anything to endanger the people that live in the areas that they serve. But the report from Judith Hackitt describes a mindset of doing things as cheaply as possible and passing on responsibility for problems and shortcomings to others. What do you say to that?
I'd refute that.
But this is her inquiry. This is what she's found, and she says that must stop.
As a private sector person as well, I can guarantee that councils around the country are probably paying more than a private sector equivalent.
All right, but let's not look at the equivalent. Let's just say, are you still trying to do things as cheaply as possible? Because, in all fairness, councils claim that they've had their budgets cut to the bone.
As efficiently as possible, not as cheaply.
So you think she's wrong when she says that?
If she, in the detail of the report, as it comes out, if she implicates councils on the basis of saving a penny to risk a pound, that's not what councils do. Councils take a long-term view of the investment they're making in those homes. Grenfell Tower had £8 million invested in it. If they weren't spending the money on the building, the fire wouldn't have happened.
Right. So what do you say about the efficiency of councils? And the one that oversaw Grenfell Tower?
Yes, well, I think that there is obviously a real need to make sure the standards are met, and that's why a review of what standards are applicable is necessary, because if those standards are higher than what is currently in place, then there will be an added burden on councils to meet additional requirements.
And should the government then put the funds behind that, if that's what's discovered?
Well, I think that there is this funding available on a discretionary basis, but I think ultimately, you know, if this is council-owned property, tenanted it out to individuals, then there is a burden on councils to undertake that the cost.
Right. Would you be happy to do that?
If it's part of the normal day-to-day cost pressures, then yes, council should account for that, and it should be accounted for through the rent book. But unexpected issues, and clearly that is an unexpected issue, nobody would have covered that building and expected that, then the government are going to have to mobilise funds, even if it's only why we as a state, and I mean standing local government and national government standing shoulder to shoulder, sue the people who have broken rules to make it happen. Because this isn't going to be about a few million, or even today's numbers a billion. This will be into billions before we've managed to resolve this issue across the whole country. This is probably the most serious issue facing our housing stock since before the war.
And is the Treasury prepared to put up that money?
Well, as I've said, there is already this fund available, and on a case-by-case basis, councils have been able to make applications and they've been considered. So there is that backdrop, and if necessary. But I think, as Gary recognises, the private sector and private rented property is a whole area which is yet unidentified, and we don't really know the extent to which fire safety regulations are being met.
All right, Gary Porter, thank you. Thank you. Now, Theresa May told the Commons last week that she wanted to make sure that disabled people who wanted to work